So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Koray and Natasha and Sasha and Ken for agreeing to have a conversation about this obviously very timely topic of COVID-19. I want to just remind the audience that this panel is recorded and will be online later on. So if you don't want to be recorded, turn off your camera. You don't really have one, but just don't actively participate. We will proceed with alphabetically, starting with Koray Caliskan, who is the Associate Professor of Strategic Design and Management at Parsons School of Design, the New School. He's also a founder of a social innovation project and a filmmaker. He's currently working on blockchains and writing a book called Data Money. Koray will talk and then I will introduce the other panels. The conversation will be in the very end. I will try, depending on the time, I will either ask people to have questions on Q&A, or we will be able to have a more verbal conversation by me allowing you to talk, but we will see later. Koray, the floor is yours. If you could try to talk for 10 to 15 minutes, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Nitsan. It's going to be shorter than 15 minutes. I have only a few ideas, and half of them may be right and to the point. So what I'm going to talk about is 4 things today about COVID and what we learn from COVID and what's going on in our lives and what is it that we need to change about ourselves from what we learned from COVID. You may hear some kind of barking in the background. That's a puppy called Effie trying to kill a monkey, little monkey toy. She is a COVID puppy. So even our family changed. We had one non-human after it. So I'm sorry if you hear barking during this talk. First, I want to talk about the responsibility of social scientists in humanity's failure to see what was coming. We were completely blind to the economic and social developments around us that seem to be created by a non-economic and non-social agent. Let me tell you what I want to say the last. I think we need to rewrite all social science textbooks after COVID because we were complicit in not seeing the virus in our societies. We studied as an externality, very much like economists study non-economic things as externalities. Our understanding of the social is limited to the extent that we do not see interaction of other living and non-living beings in creating what we see the life in general in this small planet. So I believe that we are experiencing an eclipse of vision in social sciences. If you're interested in what I mean by this, you can check out Eurozine's issue on, I'm texting it here. It's a piece that Donald Mackenzie and I wrote in Eurozine about the nature of this eclipse so that I don't take too much time. But the main idea actually is that the pioneer sociologists who saw non-social things and their effect on us for the first time can be drawn on a little bit better in order to imagine a post-sociology where we do not put at the center of our analysis human, individual, and collective identities. There's nothing wrong in what we do, I believe. And SASE is one of the best places to see new research with new theories to the point. So we are already avant-garde in social theory, but since we are already out there in the front, why don't we push it a little bit more to think about how a theory after post-sociology, a post-social theory even, would show us. I'm not talking about condition of possibility approaches, like Karl Polanyi institutions. The condition of market is non-economic kind of condition of possibility. I'm not talking about social consequences approaches. What are the social consequences of this on that? They are very valuable, they are very important. I'm talking about hardcore social theory to locate the ways in which we interact with social and non-social actors, the nature of which requires us to rethink what is going on around us in a new way, which takes me to my second point. We may have disagreements between positivists and non-positivists, and neoclassical approaches and institutional approaches, ethnographers and surveying sociologists. But at the end of the day, we're doing the same thing. We are observing and writing down and moving on. That's it. We observe in different ways. I carry out ethnography and computational text analysis. So like I try to look at both the hyper-positivist ways of doing things. It doesn't show much. Like you run a computational text analysis of Bible or Quran or Torah, you think that it's about God. They are not about God, they're about us. But by and large, what we do is, even in the purely theoretical rational choice theories that I was trained to study at NYU's political science department, we are theorists in the sense that we're just writing down. You may ask, what are we going to do? We write about societies, are we going to build them? We write about, no. What I'm saying is perhaps it's time to go back to an interaction between two different human practices, thinking and making. What if we go back in time and think like John Dewey, not philosophically or politically? He was great, but I'm not propagating pragmatism here. What I'm trying to say is that let's think like him and begin to make to think instead of think to make simultaneously. You may ask why. Why is this relevant? I think it's very relevant because agents like virus are making things, not necessarily without thinking. Because we locate thinking so much as the seat of agency, we try to locate actants, actors, collective or individual, class to gender, individual to Kurd. After we locate certain intentions, but we sociologists have already shown that we rarely do things after thinking. We're almost like, thanks to these courses, our responses are automatic. When we drive, we don't think. So we are actually making, much like virus, in a different way. If this is the case, how would we incorporate the practice of virus into our social theory via making? This has already started. Strategic designers and speculative designers, think about them as applied sociologists, right? And I'm not talking about like applied behavioralist science. I'm talking about people like Tony Raby, Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby in their work say speculative everything. Instead of asking what is, how about we begin to imagine and make worlds, their representations, visual things, this and that, in order to probe different possibilities of thinking, in order to make to think and think to make. If I may give an example, I teach monetary theory and monies at New School. And instead of teaching them a lot of Keynes and monetary theories and social, Vivian Azelizar and Hart and, Bill Maher and this and that, I asked them one thing: to make money. Let's put together, build teams, and then make our own fiat monies. By making, I meant actual money, a form with its materiality. If I may give another example, in my new economies class in late August, when we started, like around a year ago before COVID hit, I asked students to imagine that our economies would collapse because of, say, a virus, because of a planetary object. What would happen if you learned that everything around New York City would collapse in a matter of 3 months, but that it's coming? What would you do as sociologists / designers, as theorists, as people? It was a fun exercise. We put together a lot of scenarios. We tried to analyze the conditions of it. And then one group studied social conditions, the other social consequences. One of them looked at theory making and making theory in order to incorporate practices of planned behavior and unplanned behavior, survival behavior of different species and their interaction in a post-society. There were 2 or 3 guests. They found it amusing, because it's amusing, right? I mean, strange people are doing strange things. And then approximately 4 weeks later, COVID struck. And approximately 10 weeks later, the entire economy around us collapsed in an unprecedented way. Now, New School is studying this exercise, this speculative sociological design exercise, in order to see, what if we try to replicate that in other things and then incorporate such things into teaching social theory? My third point, it's about social and political consequences of COVID. So the first 2 were substantive, whose answers I don't know. I proposed one way, in a platform of thinking, theoretical platform of talking, to start doing things together as designers too. I also located a problem, a vacuum in social theory, because it was too good, not because it was too weak. It was very good to study a sociological center universe, much like economists study the economy and then think about what we do as externality. So what if we were like economists, and as sociologists, we're doing a similar thing? So my second point was that perhaps it's time to move on. And there are many sociologists who started doing this. Started 50 years ago, quarter century ago, a whole new approach emerged to give us flashlights in darkness to try to understand how we can make such a post-sociological theory. My third point is about political sociology and economic consequences. Because of the fact that virus and men, and they are usually men, all these bad people, cooperate in unforeseen ways, we may be seeing the emergence of biofascism, whereby right-wing politicians and social groups are subcontracting a mild genocide of Blacks, Latinos, the poor, the old to the virus. So how is it possible to imagine that cooperation that we see every day in New York City, if we were careful in understanding what was going on, and if the right wing was not that powerful, you would see saving of thousands of lives, and it didn't happen. That was very sad.
Right.
So I have 1 more minute
Yeah.
to go. And in that last minute, I'm going to introduce you my 4th point. We need to not only reimagine sociology, introduce making to our theoretical seat, study the political consequence of vast importance to the extent that we see killing of Black and Latino communities, not because of virus, but because men and virus cooperation. We also need to look at empirical research on how things are evolving around that. Probably you have heard of World Pandemic Research Network. That's the research global network that looks at social and economic consequences of pandemic. Akos Ronatas is also a reference scientist there. I'm a reference scientist there. Please join them. I don't know whether there are reference scientists in our panel, but join them, and then let's try to build a better shield against those catastrophes awaiting for us. Thank you very much, Nitsan, for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Natasha Iskander, who's an associate professor of urban planning and public service at NYU. Her work focuses on the relationship between migration and economic development. She's currently writing a book called The Skill and Bondage: Migrant Workers in 21st Century Qatar and Beyond. And I am going to be the slide master here, correct? So I'm going to share my screen. And Natasha will be the one presenting, and I will move the slides as she speaks. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you so much, Nitsan, and thank you for convening this fantastic panel. And thank you in advance for your help with the slides this morning. I want to talk a little bit about the coronavirus pandemic in Qatar. Why Qatar? Qatar is, it's this tiny little country kind of appended to the Persian Gulf Peninsula. But it is a country of extremes, and because it is a country of extremes, it allows us to see things in higher relief than we might see them in other places. And the one feature here that I think is really worth noting before we launch in is that Qatar is a place where labor is divorced from citizenship. So 95% of the labor force is non-citizen, is not immigrant, but migrant, the distinction being that there's no right to residency. Right to residency divorced from work. So migrants are in Qatar solely for the purposes of working. And that is kind of the photo negative of the typical migration story, where some percentage of the labor market is non-citizen and whose right to residence may or may not be attached to their function in the labor market. This particular configuration allows us to see dynamics that might otherwise be muddied by claims to citizenship rights that may make the perception of how public health measures are implemented in ways that build maybe on Koray's point about biofascism, although I would argue, and I will argue today, that this is not a new configuration, a new alliance, but an old one. it allows us to see these things in higher relief. So today I want to talk a little bit specifically about the use of public health measures to define the nation, and in particular, to define who belongs to the nation. Next slide, please, Nitsan.
Oops, hold on.
So Qatar, as a country of extremes, has the highest rate of per capita COVID cases anywhere in the world. This is data from yesterday. And Qatar has, over the past few weeks, managed to flatten its curve a little bit, but it still remains quite an outlier in terms of rates of COVID cases per capita. Next slide, please. In response to a curve that was exponential right from the start, the Qatari government implemented pretty drastic measures right from the start. On March 11th, so really weeks into this pandemic, and the very early days for countries that had not been living with this pandemic for a while, Qatar went from 0 to 239 cases. And in response to that, it locked down the industrial area, which is the neighborhood in Doha where migrant workers live. It completely locked it down. No transport in or out, no medical care provided within the industrial area neighborhood, no food deliveries in or out. So the few grocery stores that are on the periphery of the industrial area were not restocked. The only exception to this complete lockdown was transport to construction sites. So the 500,000 men who live in this industrial area were transported daily to construction sites to build the facilities for the World Cup games, which may or may not take place at the end of 2022. And so they were transported to construction sites every day, in and out. The Qatari government mandated that workers continue to be paid for their labor, but this was not enforced, so there was widespread non-payment of wages, and migrants were unable to return to their countries of origin. Some of this was a contractual binding, and some of it was due to the fact that travel had completely stopped, and that many countries of origin were actually not accepting returnees. Next slide, please, Nitsan. Oh, by the way, that was a photo of the industrial area. So really it gives you a sense of how this is a place that is zoned for industrial uses, but is actually a place where labor is stored. Next slide, please, Nitsan. So what happened, and this is part of the reason that Qatar has, or the reason that Qatar has some of the highest rates per capita of COVID cases. There were no measures taken within the industrial area to actually prevent the transmission of COVID within the neighborhood. Workers live in barracks where they're housed 12 to a room in very crowded conditions. There was also,
Sorry, you can continue talking, sorry.
Sure. The lack of food deliveries also meant that people were under physiological stress that was extreme, even as they were working intensive labor jobs. And at the construction site, and this photo here of construction workers is a photo that I took. On the construction sites, workers labor elbow to elbow. The construction site labor density is the highest I have ever seen, and I have studied construction sites all around the world. This is really incredibly person-to-person, contact-heavy work with a lot of collaboration, a lot of communication, precisely the kind of conditions that you might expect would lead to COVID transmission. This is an outdoor photo, but of course, construction also happens to a great extent indoors. Next slide, please. Outside this lockdown, created by what I'll describe in a moment as a cordon sanitaire, The response to COVID was radically different. So outside this area, there was world-class medical care provided, whereas none was provided inside the cordon sanitaire. Widespread testing, and also a contact app, which is relatively controversial because it has all these privacy violations, but in an authoritarian setting, you wouldn't expect any less. But really, the protocols for care and for the prevention of transmission were radically different. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about this lockdown as a cordon sanitaire. When I was trying to understand what was happening, what was the ideology of this strategy to deal with COVID and COVID transmission, I really started to see this as different than a quarantine, and began some analysis of how quarantine is different than a cordon sanitaire. So a cordon sanitaire is a line drawn around an area, and a quarantine is a line drawn around a person. This is the main distinction. So a cordon sanitaire focuses on excluding persons from areas, whereas a quarantine focuses on pathogens, such that you are removed from social life until the pathogen runs its course through your body, and then you're returned to social life. So the way to describe these distinctions a little bit more conceptually, a cordon sanitaire, which is a line drawn around a space, focuses on diseased spaces and not diseased persons, so that you can designate a whole area as diseased, as in Qatar, where the industrial area was designated as diseased. Whether or not it was diseased on March 11th was immaterial. It was designated as diseased, and how diseased it became was irrelevant. Time. The cordon sanitaire, unlike the quarantine, is divorced from the temporal dimensions of disease course in the body. Whereas a quarantine allows for the isolation of persons until they are judged non-contagious or cured from the disease, a cordon sanitaire really does not pay attention to the disease course in an individual body and is established until the threat of disease for everyone is past. Disease construed, as I'll show in a moment, in really broad social terms. And finally, a cordon sanitaire differs from a quarantine in that you divide society with a cordon into areas that are protected from contagion and areas that will be abandoned to disease wholly. So these are some photos. The top photo is a quarantine setting during the flu pandemic. The photo below is the use of the River Thames as a cordon sanitaire during a cholera epidemic in London. Next slide, please. So what does a cordon sanitaire do politically? A cordon sanitaire politically does the following things. It defines the political boundaries of the nation, and in particular defines what areas will be subject to what we call, kind of loosely, because we've added a lot of meanings to Foucault's terms, biopolitics, where there is an argument for governance for the protection of life, for the maintenance of life, and areas that are abandoned to necropolitics, right? So where we will actually force people to expose themselves to death as a kind of politics. So it divides society into those two categories. And it maps along those divides the logic of economic systems, so that you divide people who are defined by their function, right, as labor, as essential workers, from those defined by their membership to society, where your right to health and to life is not dependent on what you provide, but is just dependent on your sense, your political belonging. And then finally, these two vectors come together to spatialize politics and power, and in particular to spatialize the right to life and the abandonment to death. So this is actually a really old technology that has been used really since, like the 1400s, 1500s, but was a favored technology of colonial regimes. So here we have military plague control in India. Next slide, please. But it's actually been carried over into modern day manifestations. And as you can see from both pictures, the cordon sanitaire is not a light touch public health measure. It's enforced through military action. Next slide, please. I just want to spend just a quick note on the cordon sanitaire through history. The cordon sanitaire has a long history in many places around the world, particularly through colonial expressions of designating people as diseased and using the incidence of disease as a way to implement death and destruction. Cape Town was segregated through a cordon sanitaire. Mumbai at various points was segregated through a cordon sanitaire. Dakar, Cairo, Alexandria, it goes on and on. But in the US, we have also used cordon sanitaire pretty liberally and have applied them specifically to Chinatowns. And so this is around the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, there was a outburst of, tiny little outbursts of bubonic plague in cities throughout the US. And city governments located that plague in the Chinatowns of their cities. This was irrespective of where the plague actually manifested. And in Honolulu, this was taken to an extreme. Right, so this is Chinatown in Honolulu. I didn't include the photo of the military actually locking people into this Chinatown because I wanted to make space for the photo of the Honolulu city government actually burning down Chinatown, everything behind the cordon as a way to deal with the plague, leaving 4,000 families homeless with no documented incidents of plague inside the Chinatown. So really designating areas as places of death, subject to death and destruction. Next slide, please. So I want to show a little bit about how the cordon sanitaire in Qatar has been used to map a definition of the nation. The location of the cordon sanitaire actually in Qatar was very easy to apply because Qatar already segregates its migrant workers by skill. And it designates some areas as family areas and some areas as bachelor areas. This has nothing to do with people's marital status at all. It has to do with skill designation and class designation. So white collar workers are designated as families and blue collar workers are designated as bachelors. This is a map from the Qatar Ministry of Municipality and Environment indicating which areas families are allowed to live and move in and which areas are reserved for bachelors. The gray industrial area here is reserved for bachelors. It's useful to note that the entire sea of yellow has the same population as the industrial area. So both are about 600,000. So the industrial area is very densely packed. It's 99.5% male and it's racialized men. And these are designated as bachelors. They work on construction sites and other blue collar occupations. This segregation has long been enforced through the security services. So any bachelor in a yellow area is subject to detention, deportation, fines, long-term imprisonment, so on and so forth. The only real reason to leave the industrial areas is to work on construction sites in the yellow areas. And the yellow areas are, highly elite, and that is where the World Cup Games will be held. So imposing a cordon sanitaire around the industrial area was actually very simple to do. And it allowed the government of Qatar to concentrate its efforts to deal with the coronavirus outside in the family areas, which has led to an astronomical number of COVID cases inside the industrial area. Next slide, please. So what I want to suggest here is that this application of the cordon sanitaire was actually an expression of the vision that Qatar has for itself. So the photo on the, I don't know if it's your right or the left, the future side is the way that Qatar envisions itself in the future. It is going to be an elite economy, global elites, knowledge workers, a center for finance and tourism and culture. And the workers who are in Qatar to build that are there instrumentally, and in the future, they will no longer be there. They will be part of Qatar's past. This vision is not just a symbolic vision, it's actually encoded in these terms in Qatar's national development plans. So in a sense, what the cordon sanitaire it's reinforced this idea, right? The past is expendable. We are looking forward to not having it with us. And the future is what we want to preserve and focus on. Next, can you click on it, Nitsan? So the future here, what the cordon sanitaire is doing is actually trying to erase the past more quickly. And these are dispensable workers that are just here instrumentally. They are not part of the future that Qatar is trying to create. So it's a re-articulation, a doubling down on the definition of the nation as a place where these workers will not be. Next slide, please. You know, if we look around the world, we can imagine our borders that have come up as global cordon sanitaire, defining membership, who belongs and who doesn't. Next slide, please. But a more helpful way to think about the case of Qatar for us, if we are not in Qatar, where these, the application of these lines are not so literal, is to imagine the ways in which our public health measures are actually spatializing in a way that a cordon sanitaire might, social stratification, whether by race, class, function in the economy, etc., where we decide who is essential and who is not. So New York City did not draw a cordon sanitaire anywhere, but it might as well have. Here we can see this is a per capita COVID cases. It might as well have drawn a cordon sanitaire to exclude you know, everything that's not Manhattan and some parts of Brooklyn, right? And just decide that that is how we are going to manage this epidemic, this pandemic. So you can see that even though we didn't actually draw a cordon sanitaire the way that Qatar did, we really might as well have, and it's a cordon sanitaire that doubles down, recreates, emphasizes the spatial segregation by race and class in the city. Next slide, please.
Also 1 or 2 minutes, is that okay?
The last slide is the next slide. So we have the cordon sanitaire as a strategy to, in the US here, it's just kind of the symbolic or the de facto cordon sanitaire to spatialize social stratification and difference, but we are also seeing it increasingly used as a way to spatialize ideological difference. So designating some spaces as politically problematic and compelling them or trying to compel them to expose themselves to the virus and to potential higher rates of death. So here, the notion that universities are places where our students are being indoctrinated in some left-wing ideologies that are a threat to the Trump administration, right? If you can compel exposure, you are essentially drawing a cordon sanitaire that excludes some areas from protection. And that is what the Trump administration tried to do by compelling foreign students to attend classes in person, right? Foreign students being students who don't have obvious citizen membership to push back. But it is a way, it is a strategy, I'd like to argue, to draw a political cordon separating those areas, ideological and political areas, those areas that are deemed worth protecting and those areas that are not. And I would suggest that we should pay attention to the way that the pandemic is being used to spatialize these social hierarchies, spatialize ideological differences in the way that Koray suggested, but also in ways that are actually deeply historical, very colonial and old, and that we should look at the ways that this has been applied in the past to think about what it means going forward. I know that it feels to us like the pandemic is new and unprecedented, but it's not. And in trying to understand this, I was surprised at how little actually research there is on the use of pandemics to achieve imperial and racial class ends. Okay, with that, I'll end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for explaining the situation in Qatar and so beautifully situating it both historically, but also other equivalent contemporary examples. Thank you. Next speaker is Ken Shadlen, who is a professor of development studies at the Department of International Development at LSE. Ken's research has recently focused on the politics of intellectual property. He recently published a book called Conditions and Compliance, the Political Economy of Pharmaceutical Patents in Latin America. Ken, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Nitsan. And thanks everybody for the panel. It's not easy to follow those two presentations because I'm feeling a little bit intimidated because I don't have any of the theoretical richness that either of the first two did. I'm sort of approaching this from a different angle. I'm somebody who has been for a long time studying, simply put, the global pharmaceutical industry and a series of issues that emerge around pharmaceuticals on a global scale, innovation, access, production, and so on. So this has been an exceptionally busy time for me because basically the things that I'm interested in are front page news every day now. There's a lot happening. And what I'm trying to do is sort of think about what's going on right now in this space and what it might mean for sort of the world of pharmaceutical biomedical innovation and distribution issues going forward. So my talk is actually not theoretical at all. In fact, it's almost entirely atheoretical, but I'm going to try to basically talk about things that are happening in the world in a way that might be of some interest to the panel and to the people that are in the audience here. So, I mean, one thing to make a point about to start is that COVID-19 is not underscored a neglected disease. There was clearly a lot of underinvestment in the past, particularly for vaccines and medical devices. So the world was totally unprepared for this in a way that is sort of shocking. That's why we're actually having this conference online, is because the world was so unprepared for this. But a huge amount of innovative activities are happening right now. So in public and in private sectors, sort of the pipelines of innovation and production are bursting. So this is not like antibiotics where there aren't a lot of new products coming out, or like a lot of tropical diseases where there just isn't a lot of R&D. There are hundreds, literally hundreds of vaccines and treatments being developed. Vaccines, of course, being the things that are supposedly try to help us not get ill in the first place, or if we get ill, not spread it, and treatments being the things that when we get ill, try to keep us alive. There are new products and there are sort of new uses of old products. There's a lot going on. And what I want to do briefly in the time that I have is I want to talk about some of the key issues that are related to drug and vaccine development. So the big issues that have to do with innovation, trials, manufacturing, distribution, access. I want to talk about these in the times of COVID. I want to contrast how things happen normally. I put normally in quotation marks because there's nothing natural about the way things happen normally, but how things tend to happen normally with what's going on now, and with trying to think about what the differences might mean going forward. If there's one sort of thread that ties everything together, the biggest difference between the way things happen normally and the way what's happening now is because of this imperative to do an absolute ton very quickly. So scale and speed. It's sort of this scale and speed are changing everything. So let me start with what's a very, very oversimplified sort of traditional model of drug development, which is a mix of public and private activities, but sort of spaced out, and that the different actors tend to intervene and participate typically at very different places in the cycle. So with the risk of being overly simplified, and if there's people in the audience that work in this space, you just have to hold your breath and close your eyes and sort of let me get away with this for a few minutes. Typically, in normal times, public involvement is heavily upstream. So the public sectors invest in basic science and sort of technological and scientific platforms in identifying what are the biological mechanisms that might work and in early development of new molecules. And when I say public sector in the US, I mean, for example, either laboratories that are attached to the National Institutes of Health or universities all over the country that are basically living off NIH funding. But other countries have similar sets of arrangements. The US is just the biggest spender. The private activities tend to be further downstream in product development. So when a molecule goes from the public sector to the private sector, there's still a lot that has to be done before it ever gets into our bloodstream. The clinical trials that demonstrate whether or not the drugs are actually should ever get into our bloodstream, producing the things, manufacturing, the distribution of them, selling them, that all takes place. That's largely what the private sector does. Here, I want to just say a couple words quickly about clinical trials because I'll come back to this in a few moments here. So the clinical trials, these are like the things where we basically are testing out the drugs in smaller groups and larger groups to see whether or not they're safe and whether or not they're effective, to whether or not they should ever basically get into into the population's blood at large. I don't want to say into someone's blood because they're going into someone's blood during the trials, but I mean into patients that aren't being experimented on, so to speak. These are done typically and financed typically by private firms. In fact, that's the huge part of cost. The reason why drugs are so expensive to develop is largely because of the cost of clinical trials. And they pick their sites globally, and many times countries compete to be included. It's nice to be included in a clinical trial because it might give you early access to some potentially useful drugs. It's also a source of investment and a source of jobs, and it's also a form of sort of medical technology transfer because local physicians and local scientists get integrated into sort of cutting edge frontier research. By definition, if it's a new drug, you could say it's something about you think it's at the cutting edge. Now, of course, it's not quite as linear as I'm depicting it. Some public stuff happens downstream and some private stuff happens upstream, and there's more interaction. But for the sake of today and for the sake of time, that's an okay way of thinking about it. The public does the stuff at the beginning and the private sector takes care of everything after that. So what's going on now? What's going on now actually looks absolutely nothing at all like what I've just described. So it's the normal arrangements completely turned upside down. We have massive amounts of public expenditures, like billions of dollars and pounds and euros being spent. I mean, people following the news in the US, I mean, there's even a new sort of project in the US, which is called Operation Warp Speed, taking into account sort of the point about scale and speed, spending billions of dollars. The European Union has a similar approach. It's a bit less coordinated among the EU countries, as everything in the EU tends to be. China has something similar. It's often discussed in terms of public sector of financing innovation, but that's actually a misnomer because it's almost all about downstream stuff. It's almost all of this things where normally you would never see the public sector involved, or never is the wrong word, where very rarely do we see public sector involvement. So virtually all of the clinical trials that are taking place right now are being financed by taxpayers' money. There's a huge amount of financing taking place for manufacturing. Public sector doesn't usually pay for manufacturing. In fact, right now there's so much concern that if we're going to need, because this gets back to my point about scale, that if we're going to need billions of doses of drugs right away, that we have massive amounts of investment in production going on before we even know what is useful to produce. So a lot of the stuff might just get poured down the toilet once the clinical trials fail. The public sector is paying for all of this. Sort of people refer to this as sort of at-risk investment in scaling up manufacturing capacity. Public sector is paying sort of contract manufacturers, so pharmaceutical firms that you and I have never heard of before because they never sell any products. They just basically are sort of the own equipment manufacturers, as we would call them, of the pharmaceutical industry, paying them to scale up their production capabilities. In fact, sometimes the governments are paying firms to buy contract manufacturers, so they'll dedicate to producing these specific vaccines. Vials, syringes, I haven't yet seen any evidence that the US government is paying for like the delivery trucks to bring the stuff to the pharmacies or to the hospitals, but that's next. It's just that they don't have to get delivered yet. The level of sort of downstream public participation is unprecedented. And we see this in the European Union as well. I'm talking mostly about vaccines here, but you're also seeing this for some new treatments in which the public sector is paying for downstream manufacture trials and manufacturing. This is not the way we typically develop biomedical products. So again, there's a massive compression going on. Everything is happening at the same time. Early clinical trials are being condensed. Larger, later stage clinical trials are being set up and organized before the early trials have even finished. And like I said, we're investing in massive production to make the products before we know whether or not they're going to be useful and might possibly just get flushed down the toilet. And there's public funding throughout the cycle. I was going to say a few words about sort of the different types of funding, but I'm going to skip over that and come back to it if anybody cares. Some of this is looks. One thing I'll say here is that it's incredibly opaque, which those of us who follow the U.S. won't be surprised because everything in Washington is confusing and opaque, but it's incredibly opaque. And some of what I think is going on in the U.S. Is sort of mind-bogglingly confusing and probably corrupt, even for the current administration, in terms of the lack of control that they're putting on the recipients of the funding. But I want to say something. I want to say two things quickly about sort of access and something about power in this. The first thing I want to say about access is that there's no global allocation mechanism, neither to pay for the vaccines nor to pay for the cost of vaccination, which of course are different things. There's some arrangements, fledgling arrangements for the poorest countries in the world, but most countries are just basically have to fend for themselves. And related to this is sort of not just how much the products will cost, but who gets them first, because if there's 7 billion people in the world and there's only 1 billion vaccines, you can do the math, we're not all getting them at the same time. And so there's a scramble to secure their own supplies. This is often referred to as vaccine nationalism in the sense that I think it's actually a crappy term for it. But when people refer to vaccine nationalism, that's what they mean, essentially governments using their funds to secure their own supplies without thinking of the rest of the supplies to the rest of the world. So let me just say quickly something about trials. Because scale, which affects this massive compression, scale also affects clinical trials, I think in ways that can have implications for the political economy of access. To run a clinical trial for vaccines, you need to have they need to be really big. So you run a typical clinical trial for a treatment, and you basically give the drug to people who are ill. You might have 5,000 people in your clinical trial. Because you're running a clinical trial for something that's preventative, like a vaccine, they need to be much, much, much bigger for them to actually provide useful results. And so you sometimes need to be in the area, there'll be an area of like 30,000 people. So we're talking maybe like 6 times the size of a typical clinical trial. That means that you can only run the clinical trials in places that have a lot of the virus. You can't run a clinical trial in a place that doesn't have a lot of the virus because the odds of anybody getting infected anyway are basically nil. So you have to go to the places where the virus is raging. And right now, of course, that's easy in the US because the virus is raging in the US, but a lot of the places where the virus is currently raging, and of course you need to have fairly big populations. So what Natasha explained in Qatar wouldn't actually work. But the virus is raging in a lot of countries of the global south, particularly a lot of the countries that were on the slide that Natasha put up at the beginning, or Nitsan put up for Natasha at the beginning more accurately, are fairly middle income, fairly large countries in Latin America. South Africa also has a substantial population, and the virus is raging. The point is that I'm going to propose that virus power can be an antidote to what we call vaccine nationalism. If the United States or the European Union or the British government can say basically to AstraZeneca or to Glaxo or pick your pharmaceutical firm, in exchange for our money, which you need for one aspect of drug development, manufacturing at scale, we get priority doses. And of course, that's the way it's set up. That's even the way that the Gavi, which is supposed to distribute vaccines around the world, is set up. Then there's no reason why countries can't say, in exchange for our virus, which you need for another aspect of drug development, clinical trials to ever get your product approved, we get priority doses and attach conditions. This is just a different form of power. If we think about power as sort of the ability or the source of power, or one definition might be the ability to sort of deprive another actor of something it needs that isn't easily replaceable, high levels of virus are needed and they can't be easily replaced, and they can be withdrawn in the sense that your access to them is conditioned on certain types of behavior. The logic of what's called vaccine nationalism is that financial resources determine access, and virus power can be an antidote because the logic is that viral resources might determine access. It's sort of looking, so I said that I wanted to sort of say what has changed, like what are the difference and like what these might mean for sort of how things might look going forward. It's a bit of a cop-out here. I think we're going to come back to big debates over the conditions that are attached to public funding. This is something that some people always talk about in the US, but generally doesn't receive much attention. And I think after COVID, we'll always be asking this question about what are the conditions that are attached to public funding, particularly if there's a change in the White House in January and the skeletons starting clean out of the closet of some of the shenanigans that are going on now. As I said, the Trump administration has been shockingly, or maybe not shockingly, non-transparent in these agreements, but at some point we're going to get more information on what's actually going on. And finally, I'll just say that I think one of the things that this is making clear is sort of in a global perspective that the lack of coordination is striking. Everybody is basically forging their own deals and paving their own ways. Even what I have proposed of virus power as an antidote to vaccine nationalism is just basically everybody forging their own way and striking their own deals, just using a different currency. And so clearly there's a need for some form of coordination and cooperation. We know that the need for coordination and cooperation does not produce the coordination and the cooperation, and it especially won't produce it in the middle of a crisis, but it could hopefully reopen the debate for the next time one of these things comes around. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. I would like to ask you about the tone of your voice when you talked about public spending, but we will have to wait with that for later. Our final speaker is Sasha White, who's an assistant professor of sociology at Johns Hopkins University in the US. He's an expert on the social effects of infectious epidemic outbreaks, and he's working on a book called Epidemic Colonialism, a social history of international disease response. Sasha, you have...
Oh, thanks so much. So yeah, I'm excited to get to the discussion part of this. You know, I as a historian and medical sociologist, now I've been studying the histories of international responses to epidemic events and what they can tell us about the nature of power, economics, and geopolitics. A historical understanding of the international histories of containing infectious disease reveals a particular focus on emplacing, in large part, particular types of controls that have attempted to protect North America and European interests. So the legacies that we're seeing now in responses have a longer history that's situated very much in imperial roots of global health and the management of infectious disease. And what I want to talk about today really is the ways in which foundationally, I think COVID-19 has seemed to generate a crisis within sociology and social science more broadly about how to think about epidemics. And I want to provide some analysis of why perhaps that crisis might exist and how we can assuage that fundamentally by rethinking who we turn to for theories and concepts, and how this might actually help us better understand the social dynamics of this pandemic. So my work demonstrates a number of troubling bifurcations in how we as sociologists apprehend infectious disease. Namely, we're far too quick, I think, to distinguish histories of epidemics in the West as distinct from those occurring elsewhere around the globe. Post-colonial sociologists and scholars of Southern theory, including Rinda Bromberg, Julian Goh, and Zina Magabani, as well as scholars of Southern theory, Raywin Connell, for instance, have advocated for the troubling transformation or abolition of the Western canon in sociology. Pandemics should also be moments to trouble our assumptions of whose experiences, where, and whose voices constitute sociological evidence and can produce theory. And pandemics are not only biomedical, but also made manifest through the social and political lenses that produce the experiences and practices of those living through them. An epidemic, to quote the historian Alison Bashford, is of course biological, but also a bureaucratic and political effect. And while I would highly recommend her publications, I want to echo that both prior to COVID-19 and now, epidemics and pandemics are of urgent concern for our sociological imagination. So to consider the wider history of 19th and 20th century global public health and from a canonical lens historically is to largely bear witness to what I would call an uncritically be described as a triumphalist narrative of control, removal, or eradication of threats of infectious disease from the Western Hemisphere. Eurocentric forms of global infectious disease control, scientific understandings of epidemiology and germ theory, as well as the development of sanitation systems, spurred an epidemiological transition in the West in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For the first time, urban spaces became more healthsome than rural areas, and infectious diseases became lesser threats relative to chronic diseases that we associate today as the primary drivers of mortality: cancers, heart disease, diabetes, and others. The largely effective eradication of mosquito-borne diseases from Europe and North America through large-scale eradication campaigns brought many diseases like malaria and yellow fever to heal in the United States and across Europe. It may surprise many to know that malaria was not uncommon in the early 20th century, as far north as the south coast of Britain. In the later 20th century, eradication of smallpox and the mostly successful eradication of polio led many by the 1970s to believe that we as a species had defeated the threat of infectious disease. Even the devastating pandemic of HIV/AIDS today is received as a somewhat triumphal story of the transformation of an infectious, deadly illness into a chronic, lifelong, but manageable condition. It is often only in the work of scholars on HIV/AIDS outside of the West or examining marginalized communities that we see the hardships associated with this disease. Sociology has largely, as a field, ignored epidemics and pandemics as subjects or phenomena of study unto themselves, save for a brilliant volume in Sociology of Health and Illness entitled Pandemics and Emerging Infectious Diseases, the Sociological Agenda from 2013. And this may be because the acute nature of the emergence often means that by the time one is actually able to conduct ethnographic or targeted research and cleared the funding, ethical, and logistical hurdles to conduct such research, the epidemic may have expired. There are, of course, also, as we are seeing, significant physical risks to undertaking such research. But I want to get back to this question of looking at epidemics as a particular sociological phenomenon and as a social force. Maynard Swanson, in his work on plague and racist sanitation and practices in 1901 Cape Town, reflected, echoing Louis Chevalier, that epidemics do not create abnormal situations, rather sharpen existing behavior, which betray deeply rooted and continuing social imbalances. My experience studying histories of international epidemic responses can attest to this perspective. Very recent work has been examining these questions, including Naomi Klein's recent analysis of the COVID-19 pandemic in the context of disaster capitalism, which suggests that pandemics come to be framed and responded to in the context of free market ideology, for instance. Similarly, the current responses to COVID-19 have exposed how latent inequalities, especially within US society, exposes how access to care, resources, and even who gets sick and who doesn't fissure along racial and socioeconomic lines. Epidemics have historically produced aggressive responses against those historically marginalized by society. And there's a wealth of literature on this. How pandemics expose, reproduce, and highlight crises of inequality and economic systems allows sociologists to examine what may otherwise be discrete phenomena affecting particular populations play out in real time, actually in a much larger scale. There's also, I would argue, an issue of perspective that clouds sociological analysis of infectious disease. The most sustained inquiry into what I would call acute epidemics, such as the recent epidemics of Ebola virus disease in West Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zika virus, or yellow fever, are usually taken up in the somewhat amorphous domain of global health research, which focuses by and large upon the concerns and health problems occurring in the quote unquote developing world. This leaves North America and Europe often outside the realms of direct analysis or comparison, except in cases examining migrant populations and the international organizations and geopolitical entities involved in health policy making. And while hugely important analyses, much of the thought produced within the domain of global health upon infectious disease, by focusing on the developing world, perhaps would overassume the differences and dynamics shaping epidemic responses and crises based on this distinction between West and the rest. We see this both in the public sphere and in academia. This has had a persistent effect on the way this pandemic of COVID-19 has been discussed, theorized, and ultimately affected the ways to which it has been responded. No doubt we've all read many news articles comparing this pandemic to the 1918 influenza pandemic. In both public press as well as in medical fields, close comparisons between the two largest respiratory-borne pandemics of recent times are made. While there are significant similarities, certainly in the scale of the pandemics and the epidemiological dynamics of the two diseases, I would suggest that our knee-jerk comparison to 1918 reflects also a somewhat false perception that the last time an epidemic of this scale graced our shores was 100 years ago. Such a perspective elides more recent histories and voices who may likely provide more critical and important understanding to our current moment. As we consider the lessons we will learn from COVID-19 about sovereignty, state power, geopolitics, bureaucracy, and other objects of sociological analysis, we should be aware of the silos that we have constructed for ourselves as theorists that silence the voices of those with particular experiences with epidemics. As we recognize the challenges of the health community, as well as the general public, to convince the federal government to respond more forcefully to an epidemic in the United States that's killed well over 100,000 people, we should recall that this is not itself a novel phenomenon when we consider the massive efforts of the citizen scientists, gay, lesbian, and civil rights, and HIV positive activists to fight for healthcare provision against discrimination for federal support during the early days of the HIV epidemic. When we consider the xenophobia surrounding COVID-19, we must, as Natasha mentioned, consider this also within the larger context of long histories of xenophobic and anti-Asian discourses around migration and disease threat, which have a long history in America, as well as racist responses to plague in Cape Town, as well as caste-based responses in India and many other places. Similarly, when sociological theory must consider the ways in which structural racism has placed minority groups at greater risk of COVID-19 mortality, we should position such understandings within longer legacies of medical experimentation, exclusion, and violences imposed upon marginalized groups in America. While there are examples that may be excluded from a US-centric analysis of our current moment, the earlier mentioned bifurcation between epidemics in West and rest must also be troubled. Currently, the United States is the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. Doctors, nurses, and care providers across the country are still rationing personal protective equipment, and loved ones are being taken to hospital while their families wonder whether they will ever see them alive again. People die socially distanced deaths in intensive care units as loved ones say goodbye via video call. All the while, far less support has been provided by the state than needed. Absent from most discussions I've seen are the comparisons between our moment today in the West and the recent West African Ebola virus epidemic of 2014 to 2016. The nations of Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia during that time suffered the deadliest Ebola epidemic in history. And for a period of 2 years, social distancing, curfews, and hand washing requirements were employed across the three countries. Doctors went without effective personal protective equipment, contact tracing was mobilized to count cases and find contacts, and central governments struggled to support the populace. Patients were taken away to hospitals not knowing if they would see their families again. And as research on the West African Ebola epidemic has shown, far from the cultural stereotypes of unsanitary behaviors spreading the disease in light of the challenges and failure of centrally coordinated responses, communities banded together to produce solutions to halt the spread of the pandemic. And while a huge internal effort was also required, people connected to control this disease. So to conclude, as we confront our tasks as sociologists to consider our particular moment, theorize its causes, and understand the effects of this pandemic, I would suggest that we turn to the voices that our field has historically marginalized and learn from those who have experienced epidemics and whose experience could teach us a great deal. Our previously comfortable belief that epidemics in the West play out fundamentally differently from those in Africa or Asia or South America has foundationally been shattered. While the voices of those who have battled the worst pandemics of recent times around the world and in the United States and in Europe more broadly also go unheeded. So as we write the sociology to explain this moment, we'd be loath to not make these experiences central to our analysis. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sasha. Thank you all. This panel was intentionally supposed to be non-focused with different theoretical and disciplinary and geographical and empirical orientations. And I think we learned a lot as a result, but I also see a lot of complementarities and overlapping ways of thinking, particularly maybe about the issue of power and inequality. I was hoping to have time to allow people to talk with you, but we only have 15 minutes. So for the audience, I suggest that you can just write your questions in the Q&A function, and I will try to efficiently moderate the questions so that we can get as many questions as possible. So if you have questions to the audience, just to repeat, there's a Q&A function on the right side at the bottom. Feel free to type the questions, and I will convey them to the audience. In the meantime, just as a way to open up the conversation, I was wondering if some of you would like to answer, to ask others questions. I know that Ken has a question. Yes.
I'd like to ask Natasha a question. Natasha, I thought that was really fantastic. I really enjoyed it. As you were talking about the sort of the cordon sanitaire and excuse my bad pronunciation, I was thinking about what here is often called sort of the local lockdowns, in which areas are sort of, and it strikes me that the big difference, and correct me if I'm wrong, and there is a question here, the big difference is like what happens within. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about within the industrial area, like what actually happens. Is there any medical care? And then related to that, I just wonder, is it sort of in the spirit, the very sad spirit, but in the spirit of cordon sanitaire, would you put the example that the US is essentially deporting infected people to Central America, putting them on planes, knowing that they are infectious, and putting them into very poor countries that have very poor healthcare systems without actually any assistance to the healthcare system there too? That sort of strikes me as also a kind of effectively similar to what you're describing. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Ken. I would say that I'm going to answer the second part first. Most definitely, right? Like the notion that we are establishing a cordon sanitaire around our border is something that the U.S. is doubling down on in a really problematic way, and in ways that are really divorced from empirics in some important sense, in that the U.S. really has a much higher rate of infection than many of the countries it's excluding by closing its borders, right? But there's a symbolic cordon sanitaire. The reason that Qatar is a useful example is that the symbolic and the literal live very close together, in part because there are no citizenship rights. So you get to see things in higher relief. There is no care in the industrial area. Of late, there has been the beginnings of some testing, but even if you are identified as having COVID, there's no place to quarantine, right? There's no place to separate yourself out from the labor barracks that you are living in. And so it's actually immaterial. The more troubling thing is that healthcare has been used as a way to reinforce the cordon sanitaire, so that people who seem to be wandering either near the boundary of the cordon or who have crossed out of it are picked up by the security services and told that they are going to be taken for healthcare. Usually when people leave the industrial area, it's just look for healthcare. And they've actually been picked up under false pretenses and thrown into detention, right? So this is a pretty dramatic expression of the cordon sanitaire.
We have a shy audience, so we don't have questions just yet. Do you have I have a question for Ken, if I'm allowed, but Sasha and Koray, do you have any questions to your fellow?
After you, Nitsan, I have so many questions, and I'd like to thank Ken for giving an theoretical talk. I took so many theory notes during his talk, but I have a question after you.
So Ken, my reference to the tone was the fact that there was skepticism in your tone that you did not actually articulate, and you didn't say how you evaluate the greater investment, greater public investment in the development of vaccine and so on. And I'm thinking about it in the context in which there's a major debate, which of course you're familiar with, in regard to the fact that even though private companies are the ones that extract all the profit from pharmaceutical development and distribution, there's a lot of invisible public investment in the research and development in pharmaceuticals that is not appreciated and is not monetized. So I was wondering, what do you think are the economic as well as maybe political and health implications of the fact that there is this major public investment that maybe is more visible in this particular case?
So I'll be very brief here, but one of the points is that the major public investments now are much more visible. So one of the points that I was trying to make is that the difference between COVID and normal times is precisely that the public investments are incredibly visible. I mean, you have to be looking, but for the people who look in the area, like if you study the pharmaceutical industry, in normal times, the major public investments are very hidden because they're so far upstream. And right now they're visible. They're there. They're totally unmissable because they're huge and they're downstream and they're on all of the. You can't miss them. I actually think it's great, and it provides an opportunity to leverage public investment in a way that is not typically done in terms of applying conditions to it on access and prices. I think it's being underexploited. So if I was skeptical in my talk, it's not about the principle of massive downstream public funding, but it's about sort of the missed opportunities of massive downstream public funding that's going on right now. But I think that if this works, of course, none of this might work. All this stuff might be, it might all go down the toilet, to continue with that metaphor. But if this works, it might be hard to ever go back to the old way of that, with that division of labor where the public's upstream and the private is downstream. Because if this works, this might be a new way of doing it. So we'll have to see.
So Koray, if I may, I want to integrate the audience, and Tim Bartley has a question. So let me read it. Tim says, fascinating panel and how to know where to start. One thing I'm curious about is whether you all have examples of new forms of solidarity. That might be hard for Natasha. New forms of solidarity and bottom-up popular innovation that are reshaping the trajectory of the pandemic and its associated politics. Sasha mentioned this in the case of Ebola. Are there interesting examples for COVID? So maybe, Sasha, you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to. I mean, there's a great, a really interesting book by Paul Richards that I'm putting in the, I put it in the wrong chat, but here we go, about how people science really helped to end the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. You know, I think that's an area where a lot of research still needs to be done, but I think that, you know, what we saw in the early days, at least in the US, around COVID, in terms of communities mobilizing to deliver food and goods to you know, the elderly populations, and these forms of community organizing is a space for a great deal of sociological research. You know, which I think we'll see more and more as the pandemic moves on. That's one example, but I think we'll see a host of others. And I think the practice of, you know, people sewing masks and creating PPEs and things are other areas where, in the absence of sustained state interventions and provisions, we've seen a host of small-scale actions being taken by people on behalf of their neighbors and fellow humans.
Natasha?
I would just add that I think we need to include in that definition some of the initiatives that we've seen by kind of narco governance in communities where, you know, the governance structures of drug dealers are actually imposing curfews and lockdowns of various forms, distributing food. In Mexico, El Chapo has distributed PPE with his face on it, right? Like there is really, there are multiple forms of non-traditional government intervention, but that are quite close to government in terms of the intentionality around it.
Thank you. Koray or Ken, any comments about this specific question? No. Okay.
I have no illustrations.
Koray, you want to ask your question?
It's so funny. In order to say no with my head, I unmuted myself. We're still getting used to those digital things. My question is actually to Natasha, but anyone can take about it. I think it was fantastic to revisit cordon sanitaire, this idea, but we may also think about it as a design intervention in human life that came out in 19th century. So it's about making a thing, a device used by human actors to be applied in a specific way. So I would invite Natasha to think about something like a cordon digital. What is going on new right now with the implementation of those new cordons of 21st century on the digital landscape? I'm not mobilizing a rupture talk. We used to have, you know, non-digital things and material things, and now we have digital things now. These digital things are enmeshed with materialities and they entail new materialities. How would you think of these novelties, such as surveillance of citizens from Israel to China, in Germany, that Nitsan's presidential address was fantastic in locating? What design interventions are sociologically and politically mobilized in the 21st century? Can we talk something like cordon digital? Would this be a neologism? Aishada.
So I want to offer the example of Egypt, which, you know, you can't really trust the COVID data on Egypt because I'm sure that the rates of infection are skyrocketing, but the data are censored. And people who have been posting about the crisis to the healthcare system, for example, doctors or whatever, even on, you know, private Facebook chats, have been picked up and detained. And so I think that that is a kind of informational cordon that you are talking about, so that it doesn't actually, I mean, one of the things about the way that we talk about the pandemic, and this is really to Sasha's talk, we talk about it as if it were new and unprecedented, and the technologies were new and unprecedented and dystopian in ways that we've never seen before. And we look for the most seemingly technologically advanced symbols to discuss this, right? The things that are most futurist. But I would say that these strategies are really old, and the ways that we use the infrastructure we have now today are actually just repetitions of things that we've done, you know, throughout, with the same kind of impetus, really the political control, the imperial design, right? Like there's nothing new here. It's just the infrastructure is a little bit newer. That's it. That's what I would say.
As you see, I'm thinking whether there's nothing. I don't want to say like structurally everything is new, but I think things are things may be changing categorically in terms of network effects. An infrastructure of a rail network is fundamentally different from infrastructure of Google. There are continuities, but I believe we are empirically observing categorically new things that require new concepts to understand them, like platformization.
Well, we might also be thinking about the newness here might be also about the information about, right? So that it's not just the people that are being controlled, but information about what is happening that is being controlled in a new way behind a cordon.
Yeah, exactly.
This also maybe relates to Ken's talk.
Exactly. What makes things more complicated, if my president lets me say 2 sentences, is that representations as forms of governmentality are categorically different than representations as data that build infrastructures for action. Data is a representation, very much like Roman numerals, Arabic numerals, 2 representations materially different. So the way they are enmeshed in our sociological news structures seem to be different, Natasha, in the work that I'm trying to understand. But we're also professionally seeking to see new things to give our concepts. So I understand that there's a conflict of interest here too, but it's very difficult to convince a historian on novelty of things in 21st century, and I understand it, and it's legitimate.
Sasha, you want to jump in as a conclusion?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are a lot of novel elements to COVID-19 for sure. One thing I'd want to say is what's, I studied the history of the international health regulations, which were the international sanitary conventions before that. And I'm immensely grateful to all of Nitsan's work on the World Health Organization for so much of my work. But I think what's interesting is we see in justifications for international controls around infectious disease, the justifications from the 1850s to the present have been largely the same, which is that the pace of global trade and traffic has increased, and as a result, we need infectious disease controls to, to provide maximum protection against infectious disease with minimum effects to trade and traffic. And to some extent, we had epidemic surveillance information traveling across the world by telegraph in the 19th century, which looks like a slow version of what we've got now in a lot of ways. You would be able to make the kind of Johns Hopkins CSSE map just 3 or 4 days delayed in 1901. But I think the ways in which these systems have transformed is where we're seeing the new things. But in order to see that, we also have to recognize, I think, that in some respects, we're not that different now than we were in 1918, when social distancing and quarantines were the only responses to, and mask wearing were the only responses to the flu that were effective, for instance. I also realized I just used the 1918 flu as the example when I said, we should move from that example, but anyway.
We have run out of time. Thank you for the audience, and thank you in particular for all the participants. It was extremely illuminating and thought-provoking. Thank you for doing this for us. And keep safe.